Welcome to this month's iteration of SureCloud's threat briefing. My name's Craig Moores. As usual, I'm joined by Hugh. We got some interesting topics to talk about this afternoon. So over the last few weeks, we've been gathering together some of the information that's prevalent within the threat landscape at the moment. No surprise, we're going to spend a bit of time talking about the emerging cyber threats from Russia's war on Ukraine. We're also going to look at some of the areas of zero trust as kind of this default cyber posture that's come out from the NCSC in recent weeks. We're going to talk a little bit about the threat of phishing and ransomware within the threat landscape. Again, some interesting facts and figures come out around that more recently. So let's start with probably the topic and the question that we're asked the most at the moment, Hugh. So around the emerging cyber threats from Russia's war on Ukraine. What's your take on this? What do you think is kind of pragmatic advice for organizations at the moment?
So a lot of the stuff is going to be the same as what we've talked about before. Even though we're dealing with really highly technical criminal groups and nation state threat actors, the threats that they're exploiting, the activities they're conducting, are pretty much the same as what we've seen previously, at least from the perspective of how we look to mitigate that risk. So phishing, especially spear phishing, is one of their most common methods of gaining initial access. And so again, with that fairly typical control, we're just looking to make sure that we've got our user training and awareness up to scratch. Where we're looking at maybe really highly technical exploitation of 0 days, well, we're looking to just make sure that our systems are patched and up to date. Again, as we've mentioned in a previous iteration, we've got to consider the supply chain as well. So while you might think you're not necessarily a target, if you're downstream of someone who is a target, then that's also a consideration. And just making sure that we're doing, supplier due diligence, and making sure that we're sort of operating in a, as we're going to talk about later, a sort of a zero trust approach. It will go a long way to making sure that we are well secured against these emerging threats.
Thanks. So continuing to do the basics in a kind of robust and structured manner in that case. So I guess from looking around at some of the things that are out in the landscape at the moment, then Hugh, what's the kind of targets? What are kind of the things that the nation state actors are potentially targeting? And are there any particular sectors or types of organizations that could be a potential target that our listeners might be interested in?
Yeah, so the NCSC have said that at the moment there's no direct threat to organizations in the UK as a result of the conflict. But I wouldn't take that to mean that you're not going to get caught up in it. So while we're seeing the nation states sort of fighting between themselves, as you'd expect, what we are also seeing, partially due to Russian legislation around the fact that they will only prosecute criminals and threat actors within Russia if they attack a Russian organization or entity themselves. As a result of that, we're seeing sort of patriots, basically Russian patriots, supporters of the regime, taking it upon themselves to target, typically in a disruptive manner rather than a sort of data security risk, target organizations that are outspoken in support for Ukraine or condemnation of the Russian regime. So yeah, if your organization is quite rightly so, putting out messages of support and solidarity with Ukraine, that would potentially cause you to come into the sights of some of these criminal groups that just want to cause disruption.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So from a more generalized perspective, then, how are they picking their targets? I've seen a lot of interesting things around potentially how they're targeting or identifying targets. What are some of the common things you've seen, and potentially maybe even some of the trivial things that you've seen that may help to protect organizations?
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff that's going around at the moment is specifically, and again, referencing that Russian legislation that we mentioned earlier about protecting, or if there's no Russian victim, there's no prosecutable crime. A lot of the malware at the moment is doing a check before it executes, specifically ransomware, and it's actually looking for whether Russian or former Soviet language packs are installed on the machine prior to execution. So it's a pretty janky workaround, but actually something I'd advise at the moment, if you haven't already, try and just install a Russian language pack onto your operating system, because although it's going to have sort of no negative impact on you unless you accidentally switch to a language you don't understand, it's a potential sort of last effort lifesaver.
That's interesting. I guess I hadn't really thought about implementing controls in such a way, but I guess from a protection perspective, we'd hope that our kind of defense in depth model is helping us, to the degree where we don't have to rely on installing language packs. But I guess looking, one of the interesting points you made was around supply chain. I think a lot of the organizations that I've been talking to, are maybe not directly concerned about themselves, but potentially, as you rightly pointed out, services they provide into other organizations that may form kind of part of critical national infrastructure, or maybe into areas like the DoD over in the US, or financial institutes in the UK. So one of the things you mentioned was around zero trust, which I guess brings us on quite nicely to the second area that the NCSC has made comment on in recent weeks around zero trust and working towards that as a default cyber posture. What are your thoughts on that, Hugh? I know we've covered it before, and obviously might be quite a welcome point, but where do organizations sit in terms of that guidance, and what ultimately should they be considering?
Yeah, so I guess most people in the industry would advocate moving towards that zero trust implementation approach. But I think, as the NCSC quite rightly made clear, it's important that you do it properly, because it's not really just a simple switch you can flick on. Typically, you'll be using a vendor supplied solution, but if you get it wrong and an asset is tagged wrong, or an identity is incorrect, for an individual software or a machine, sometimes things will start going badly wrong, and you won't be able to work out why. But yeah, absolutely, we're looking to make sure that we are trying to operate on that zero trust mindset. Don't just trust it because it originates from within the network. Even sort of what you might consider trivial internal networking, things like DNS. Really important that we're running DNS over TLS as well, because an attacker could come along from within your network, just poison DNS entries. Every time you then try to go to your intranet page or whatever, you could get forwarded on to an attacker controlled page or something like that.
So I guess from a general perspective as well, zero trust is useful because attackers never really land in the environment where they probably want to be. So, lateral movement and things are obviously some of the first parts of the attack path that they might take. So how does kind of zero trust in the real world help to prevent those kinds of things without maybe re-engineering or re-architecting the entire environment?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, and we just discussed, phishing is probably the most prevalent method of initial access we see. And yeah, while spear phishing is effective in making sure that you land in somewhat the right environment, it's really unlikely that that person's reading their emails with their domain administrator account. Certainly, we'd expect them to not even have email access on accounts of that privilege. If you don't have that zero trust approach, then maybe there's the potential for where that attacker lands to be able to communicate with some of these sort of crown jewel assets and high value resources. But by making sure that, okay, this user is trying to access this resource with this process at this time, okay, that's irregular behavior, they don't have authorization for that, we'll just kill that connection. Yeah, that's really valuable.
So I think building on that then from organizations that are obviously targeting zero trust models in the future, the principle of least privilege is still something that is obviously very prevalent to protecting against these types of attacks and lateral movement and things, which I think, considering our previous conversation around sort of how organizations might get caught up in the supply chain, having that least privilege, moving towards zero trust policy will really give them an advantage in stopping attackers from kind of propagating through the supply chain into their own environments. But it's important that they stay aware of that threat landscape, isn't it, as well? I think the thing that goes quite well with this is around having a good awareness of the threat models and the various kind of attack vectors that attackers are going to focus on particular organizations, and where we're maybe susceptible or exposed to kind of public domain as well, because they're going to be some of the key target points, really, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And just with everything in security, really, there's no one-stop shop, right? Zero trust in isolation isn't going to do much for you, because if you don't have, as you mentioned, the other good principles in place, your multi-factor authentication, least privilege, then as soon as an attacker can reach your policy engine, they're then able to say, oh, actually, our identity does have access to all of these resources, and you lose, all the benefit of that. So making sure that the environment as a whole has, defense in depth, bunch of good controls, and makes good use of zero trust is really what you need to ensure that overall security.
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. So I guess some of the areas, again, we picked up there were phishing and ransomware. I found it particularly interesting at the beginning of the pandemic, some of the statistics around the increase in those as kind of primary attack vectors. Looking more recently, that doesn't seem to have changed. Some of the statistics indicate that there are still real prevalent attacks across sort of ransomware that are being deployed via phishing. I mean, what are some of the statistics around those, and what do you think they mean for organizations in kind of today?
Yeah, so the NCSC have said that I think it was 91% of organizations experienced a successful phishing attack in the last year. So that's some credential capture or payload execution, which is quite significant in itself. And then 84% of those were ransomware based. So again, we're still seeing a lot of ransomware. And of those 84%, I think 60% of victims actually reported that they ended up paying the ransom, which, although the authorities will always say, never pay the ransom because you are funding serious organized crime. Clearly, a lot of organizations are in the position where they think, it's in our best interests to get this done with. I think, as going back to the spear phishing again, I think a lot of the training and awareness pieces that were working sort of 2 or 3 years ago around don't click links, you get an Excel sheet with some accounts invoices. I think people are pretty much on top of that. People are aware, I've got an email with an Excel attachment from a company I've never heard of. I'm not going to click that. Spear phishing is slightly different, obviously, in the fact that it is highly targeted to the individual that's going to be receiving that email. Careful thought and consideration has gone into the context of the email, the hook that they're trying to pull you in with, and then what they're going to do with that beyond execution. So I think that some of the automated Microsoft implementations of phishing testing and things like that are probably not quite sufficient for what we're seeing in the recent months with the highly targeted stuff. Definitely think that more training and awareness needs to go into that.
Yeah, I was quite surprised by those figures, given the kind of approach that organisations have taken over recent years to move to remote working and kind of decentralise some of their controls. I think that's quite a significant number of successful attacks, which is interesting. I think what's more interesting is that 60% of those have actually paid a ransom, which I guess in our line of work, the key question is always, do you pay the ransom or do you not pay the ransom? And as you rightly stated, I think the general guidance is always that you don't pay the ransom, quite obviously. But more of the organizations that I talk to now are actually looking at the cost benefit of actually, being in the position of having to recover from a ransomware attack and having the confidence that they've actually fully removed that versus the potential cost. And there's obviously risk associated with paying a ransom because, we've never met a particularly faithful thief, right? So it's one of those that I guess the risk is a balance from a business perspective of achieving the overall outcome, which is to continue operations. So, I mean, how would you say that compares to, obviously I referenced kind of pre-pandemic, but I mean, if you look back a little further, I mean, those kind of statistics seem like they probably should have been moving downwards rather than moving upwards. I mean, what in your experience, Hugh, how's that changed over probably a slightly longer period of maybe sort of 5 years or so?
So I think in some ways it's a good sign. I think it's the improvement in technical controls and policy and process elsewhere around organizations that have actually pushed the bar up of sort of general cyber maturity so high that it's no longer the easy way in to just scan an organization externally, find an exposed and vulnerable service and get in that way. I think organizations, we're pretty well keeping up on patching and maintenance now. And unfortunately, humans, the big fleshy meat bags we are still just as useless as we were 5 or 10 years ago. And so, yeah, unfortunately now we're just we're the easiest way in instead of the technology.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've spoken recently around the insider threat and around kind of the human layer that comes with sort of security architectures and things. So it is quite important to think about kind of where those key risks are, and I guess thinking to threat modeling and things as well. It's not ignoring the people and process elements of information security as well as kind of the technology aspects, which leads into, some of you may have noticed that we changed the format for registration for our threat briefing, and we gave you the opportunity to ask some questions that we could pose. And, there were a number that came in that were kind of relevant to what we're talking about. So I guess picking up the first one there, Hugh, around the size or potential turnover for a business that would be a typical target of cybercrime, ultimately, when does it become worth it for criminals? What's your view on that, given what we've just talked about and potentially some of the stats that we've talked about as well?
I would say it's always going to be worth it for criminals. I think that the criminal you're facing up against is going to differ depending on the size of your organization. But the smaller your company, typically the less budget you're going to be putting into securing your environments. Therefore, the easier it is to get in, and so the more worthwhile it is for maybe a small individual or small crime group to target you. Obviously, then you get to your larger organizations, multinationals. Okay, maybe foreign nation states are going to be taking an interest in those organizations because, yes, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to get in successfully. But when they do, the payoff is also huge. So I think that's really the answer, is that it's always an important consideration, and you're never invulnerable.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I mean, different actors are targeting different outcomes. Some are looking for data exfiltration, for monetizing, data and its value. Others are just looking to cause disruption or to, potentially use you as a way of sort of piggybacking into other environments, as we've seen in other attacks over recent years. So I think you're absolutely right. I think cybercrime doesn't need necessarily a value to be a target. Sometimes it can be simplicity. Sometimes, obviously, if the capability and motivation of the actors is high enough, that ultimately, you will be a target. And I think, regardless of kind of where you stand from a control perspective, in terms of the effectiveness of your controls, a lot of the organizations that I talk to now, are probably targeting more of a when we become a target, not if, which I think, going back a number of years is probably a shift in their view of that. So I guess moving on then, one of the other or a number of other questions we've had recently is around some of the common threats and threat vectors that are being used by Russian state actors, past and present, and more so how organizations can prepare for that. I think you've covered off some of that, Hugh, but have you got any other specific recommendations that people can potentially think about in terms of identified threat vectors or things they can be doing, over above cyber hygiene to protect themselves?
Yeah, so I guess important then in part of that question is to look at what are these organizations doing. So one of the biggest ones we've got is APT28, also known as Fancy Bear. Sorry, just lost my mind then. And basically, the FCO, Foreign Office, have said that these guys are basically Russian government, so state sponsored that they're pretty much one and the same. And their sort of MO seems to be going for nation state level espionage, and also media interference is a big one they're looking at. So again, not typically something that would be looking to impact every organization, but I think it's very important to just be aware of these. And so, yeah, as well as the spear phishing we've mentioned, the exploitation of 0 days, these APTs are also really hot on, as we said, like media interference, and producing fake news and things like that. And I just saw earlier today that one of these groups yesterday released a deepfake video of the Ukrainian president requesting everyone in Ukraine to drop their arms and surrender. I think it's really important that we consider the impact of that and how reliant we are on social media and Twitter and video snippets like that for our information, and the power that unfortunately in this case it wasn't a very good deepfake, but the technology definitely is there, and that could be really, really far reaching in its impact.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. We rely so much on what's being reported through the media. There were recent articles around the value of risk management in cybersecurity, which, when compared to some of the things you've just been talking about, I think we would take more assurance from maybe the focus of the article. So it's really important that we kind of consider the authenticity of some of the information that we use for intelligence when we're looking at protecting ourselves, and how that can be used really to make informed decisions about what we should be concerned about and how we should be protecting ourselves. So on a slightly different tangent but related, we had a specific question around the latest existing threat that's been identified and whether it's aligned to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. What's your view on that, Hugh?
Yeah, so something we've been seeing in recent weeks is the Ragnar Locker ransomware making a resurgence. So this was first spotted, I think, in early part of 2019. But in the last few weeks and months, especially in the US, it's been really deployed quite heavily. So it typically is targeting Western critical national infrastructure environments, primarily in the US, and it's quite clever in that it will go out and look for processes being run by managed service providers, and it will kill them first, and then it will look to deploy its ransomware. And as well as just encrypting your data, the group also then threaten to release it publicly. So you've got, not only have you lost your data, you've also potentially had everything leaked. Again, this is one of the ones that if you've got one of those former Soviet region language packs installed, it won't execute. That obviously, as we mentioned, is not a great control to rely on, but I think personally it's really an interesting thing. And yeah, no current indications that that's aligned to any geopolitical issues, but certainly it's really prevalent at the moment, and it's one we should all be keeping an eye out for.
Brilliant. Thanks, Hugh. So I guess in summary then, I mean, there are lots of discussion at the moment around cyber threats for, in relation to Russia's war on Ukraine. I think the general guidance from the NCSC is that, there's no specific target or threat to UK organisations, but I guess the message is to remain vigilant, do the basics well, and to, keep abreast of what's changing in the threat landscape. Potentially considering some of the guidance around zero trust. We've put a link in the chat for you to go and have a way and look at the zero trust guidance provided by the NCSC. So do go and have a read through that if it's of interest. Otherwise, if it is a future requirement, consider the normal sort of least privilege, making sure that you've got a good understanding of what's going on within the environment, and that can help you to protect against the ever rising and prevalent phishing and ransomware threat that is indeed not going away anytime soon. Have a look at NCSC's guidance around protecting yourself from ransomware. Hugh gave you some sort of useful tips and things to consider as well. And we have just posted a link to our podcast channel. If there are particular topics there that are of interest to you, please do go and have a listen, and let us know any feedback. Otherwise, thank you all for your time. Hopefully you found that useful, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you, Hugh, and good afternoon.